Well, welcome to question 82 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lesson is devotion. I am Dr. Thibault. Now, when we consider devotion, we are looking at the virtue of justice, and we are looking at the potential parts of justice. And this section of potential parts, we're dealing with religion. So, the virtue of religion. Now, the virtue of religion has two interior acts. So these are not separate virtues really in and of themselves, but they are acts of a virtue. So they are acts of the virtue of religion. Now these interior movements, these interior acts are devotion and prayer. So we will be covering today devotion, question 82, and the next lesson will be 83 on prayer. Now, devotion has 4 articles, and prayer has 17 articles. So prayer will be a very long section when we get to it. Although arguably, it might be more interesting than the 4 articles of devotion, which are somewhat more straightforward. St. Thomas asked the question, is devotion a special act? And St. Thomas defines devotion from its root. It's derived from the root word to devote. Devotion is to devote oneself. So in terms of the virtue of religion, it is to devote oneself to God. So one who is devout has a devotion, which is to devote oneself to God. Now, devotion is to give oneself readily to things. So to make oneself a servant of, make oneself available for, say, I'm here to do your will. Whatever you ask of me is an element of devotion. So devotion is an act of religion, Article 2. As I said, the section of devotion isn't that fascinating. It's fairly straightforward. Is devotion an act of religion? Yes. To do what pertains to worship or service of God belongs properly to religion. The will to do this act of religion is to be devout, quite obvious from its definition. Devotion to God's saints, dead or living, does not terminate in them, but passes on to God insofar as we honor God in his servants. Now, this part I thought was interesting because in that objection 3 is raised the question, well, can you be devout to anyone other than God? You have to be devout to God alone. If what this says to devote oneself, people are devoted to many things, right? People can be devoted to the military. If you're a soldier in the military, you might be devoted to that type of service, or a priest might be devoted to his bishop, or a child might be devoted to his parents, right? So that we use the word devoted in many ways. A person could be devoted to their country. Many different times we say devote, to devote oneself. Well, what St. Thomas is saying is, if you're talking about the saints, then that still is devotion to God. It doesn't terminate in the saint himself if it's proper devotion to the saints. In the Catechism, when you look at devotion, there's a section about being devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, right? So there's many things within the Catechism, and devotion is mentioned something like 30 times. Devotion, and it's often not to God in himself, but usually through other holy things. So devotion is a big part of spirituality. But to break it down again, these other secular forms of devotion is not what St. Thomas is talking about. He acknowledges that they exist, but they are more an issue of observance or some other virtue. What he's talking about is devotion in terms of being devout to God, in terms of the virtue of religion. So the others exist and they're fine, but that they're not what he's talking about here. Um, Debate comes up: is devotion really an act of religion, or is it really part of charity? And what St. Thomas points out is that all moral virtues, supernatural grace, are charity. Everything comes down to love, right? Love is the only thing that ultimately lasts. If anything is done in God, it's done in love. So to say, is it justice? Is it religion or is it love? Well, ideally, they work together, right? They work together. But to say that everything is love, well, then there is no such thing as virtue anymore, right? If we want to be, if you want to be an essentialist, then you just say all is love, right? Even faith and hope are really just love. You can kind of minimize it to one thing, but it's not particularly helpful to kind of minimize it. Um, uh, St. Thomas says charity is the principle of religion. So all religion, right, which is aims at that proper service to God, that giving God what is due, is really an act of charity, an act of love. Um, and St. Thomas uses an example that's a little bit complicated logically, and I think might be more of a medieval biology, but this idea that uh, charity both causes devotion and feeds on devotion. He uses the example of fat and heat, that fat gives off heat and heat feeds in fat. Now, I'm not sure that heat feeds into fat unless you want to say calories. In some sense, yeah, calories create fat, and then when you burn fat, it creates energy, calories of heat. So this kind of he's pointing to a circular argument and saying, well, really, charity causes devotion and feeds on devotion. So, you know, if you love your friend, you will try to serve your friend more, right? If you love your spouse, the more you try to serve your spouse. If you love God more, the more devoted you are to God. So in that way, charity creates devotion. But if you are devoted to God, you will grow in love of God. So it both is the cause and the effect in some sense. And St. Thomas is aware that that is a circular argument, but he's saying because it's a circular argument, you really can't be saying, well, it's just this and it has nothing to do with charity. Yeah, it has a lot. Devotion has a lot to do with charity. It's just not primarily a act of charity. It's an act of religion, which is the principal cause, the principal driving force of all religions. So they work together. The cause of devotion. This one is kind of an interesting one. There are two parts of the cause of devotion. First, the extrinsic, the chief cause of devotion is God. Without God, there would be nothing to be devout to. To whom to be devout. Um, so God as the final object, the final end of devotion, is the cause of it, right? The cause of a trip is the destination. Otherwise, you wouldn't have begun the trip. The destination is built into the first steps of moving on to that destination, onto that journey. Now, that's fine. But now the intrinsic causes of devotion, uh, St. Thomas says, are meditation or contemplation. He really means meditation and contemplation as kind of synonyms in this sense. Um, Through meditation, man conceives of the thought of surrendering himself to God's service. So when we meditate, contemplate, these are internal movements of the will, an internal reflection, uh, right? Which makes sense since devotion is one of these internal internal acts, right? This is the section we're under is internal acts, which are devotion and prayer. So part of this internal devotion is this meditating upon God. And if we meditate upon God, then we surrender ourselves to God more and to God's service more. So who doesn't serve God? People who are too busy to even consider it. If you go and spend every day you go and pray a holy hour, and meditate for that 1 hour before the Blessed Sacrament, you can't help but pray the words, I surrender myself to you, I'll do whatever you ask. Uh, if that part doesn't come up in the conversation with God in the meditation, after few hours, perhaps you need to refocus your spiritual life a bit more. Um, but the surrendering of self is pretty important to the meditation process, the contemplation. Um, and I love this line of from St. Thomas: God is supremely lovable. I think that's a very deep line. We tend to think of God as being somewhat difficult. As St. Teresa of Avila said, God, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them. I think this is the way we typically think of God in terms of our spiritual lives, is that God is challenging. God can be difficult. God comforts the afflicted, but afflicts the comfortable. Right? This type of idea. So to say, well, God is actually supremely lovable. uh, is, is a bit of a jarring thing. But if you think about what lovable is, it might not mean a soft little cute teddy bear, but actual love. Well, then yes, quite obviously yes. A God who gives his life in sacrifice for you would be somebody who is lovable, right? God has proven his love for us, therefore, there's nothing not to love in return. Um, and the more we meditate upon God, the more we will love God, the more God it becomes lovable. Uh, Again, the one who does not love God is one who is too busy to properly meditate and contemplate on the essence of God, the acts of God. Now, the final article of this section is what are the effects of devotion? And St. Thomas says there are two effects of devotion: joy and sorrow, which sound like opposites, don't they? Joy and sorrow. You think, if I'm joyful, I'm probably not sorrowful, and if I'm sorrowful, I'm probably not joyful. And I think St. Thomas makes a very good point. The more devout we are to God, the more spiritual joy we find, the more we find peace, the more we find truth in itself, beauty, the more we find love. These are all positive things. These will cause us to have some sense of spiritual joy. But what else comes with this type of meditation and devotion? Well, also an awareness of our failings, right? So if we become more aware of our failings, if we become more aware of our sin, then our awareness of our sin will make us sad indirectly. This is an accidental effect. It's not what was intended in devotion. The intent of devotion um, is not to create sorrow in the devout person. It's to give proper justice to God, which is try to offer God what is due to him through internal acts of will, which is devotion, and should bring us joy, and it does. And it also makes us aware of our failings, which should create sorrow. If you have some sense of guilt, which you should feel guilt for your um, failings, and then repent, and then live more in the joy and less in the sorrow, right? The goal isn't to increase the sorrow, it's to increase the joy. Um, so that's possible for anyone who goes down that road. Um, Says the Lord gives delight, but our failings give us sorrow. Right? Straightforward. So in conclusion, devotion is a special act towards God. Um, uh, Really, you can be devout to many things, but what St. Thomas is talking about is this type of devotion is specific towards God. Because of that, it's a special act. It's not the act that we give to everyone. It's this particular type of devotion we give to God alone. Devotion is an act of religion. It's also is part of charity, but directly it's an act of religion. Um, Meditation and contemplation cause interior devotion. Um, God Himself is the external cause of devotion as its end, final desire. Um, the effects of devotion are joy and sorrow. As just very recently stated, previously stated, devotion gives us joy in God, in life in God, but it also makes us aware of our failings, which should then give us properly some sorrow and enough sorrow that we feel guilt, enough guilt so that we repent and turn towards God and live more in the light. So, uh, this is all I have on devotion, and we will next time be discussing prayer.